I've confessed to you already that I'm not much of a sports fan. I like sports, but I don't follow any one particular team, nor do I watch any sports activities on a regular basis, which makes me a very bad sports fan. But I have discovered that my very favorite way of celebrating the 4th of July is by going to an old-fashioned all-American baseball game. I missed that this year. I remember one year, somewhere during the national anthem and before the fireworks, the crowd watched as a team of people carrying something spaced themselves from home plate all the way out along the baseline to the middle of the outfield. And as the national anthem was being sung, we watched as this team of people began to unfurl a flag. The crowd saw red and then white, and the stripes continued until a field of blue and stars. It was the largest flag I have ever seen. And it was the flag of the United States of America. This flag represented the courage to fight against tyranny. The flag represented the bravery it takes to stand up for what you believe and to fight for freedom. The flag represented our nation's commitment to an intellectual citizenry. I can't even say that. Talk about intellectual, we'll just forget that. But we're committed to educating our citizenship, our citizens. I still can't say that word. We're committed to that. And because of that commitment for education and having education be available to everyone, we've been able to make technological advances and we've been able to cure diseases. We've been able to explore the universe. This flag represents the freedom that we have granted to artists and philosophers as they help us become aware and understand and to experience beauty and truth, all of that wrapped up into this enormous flag covering much of the baseball field. Now, I'm not really a sentimental person. I mean, there are a few things that get to me, babies, kittens, love songs. But the flag really had never been one of those things that pulled on my emotional heartstrings. But that day, I couldn't stop the tears. It was beautiful to remember all that is American and all that is good. The people in the Bible were proud of their country too, the biblical country. It began with Abraham. Through the covenant with God, Abraham became the forefather of all the descendants that became a nation. And Moses, through the call of God, was led to the promised land, that land flowing with milk and honey, that land that was intended to be a place that would care for the widows and the orphans and the strangers. And King Solomon built on that land in Jerusalem, the temple that would be the landmark of that nation called by God, that landmark that would signify that this is where you could always find God, where God would always be worshiped. That's the biblical country that the biblical ancestors were proud of. It was a country with a high calling. Elimelech and Naomi, they were proud of their country too. Judah as part of the southern and northern kingdom of Israel and Judah, that was all God's nation. They were proud of their country, but there was a famine, and they had no place to go except for Moab. If they were like their other tribesmen, then Elimelech and Naomi would not have thought too highly of the Moabites. Moab and Judah, even Israel, there was a long history of conflict between those two nations, those two countries, probably stemming from the fact that the Moabites were said to have been the descendants of Lot and Lot's daughters through an incestuous union. That didn't sit well. And in fact, that tension between the Moabites and all the other people of God is embedded in the Torah, the law, as it states, no Moabite may enter the assembly of the Lord, not even to the 10th generation. That kind of attitude, when it's codified in law, is hard to overcome. But Elimelech and Naomi, they needed food, so they went to Moab. This story of these people, the book of Ruth, is sandwiched between the rest of the history of the Israelite people. And what comes right before the book of Ruth is the book of Judges. And that's a book that describes a very dark time in the people of God's history. It was full of stories, horrific acts of carnage and murder and assassinations and near genocide and rape. The country of Judah, despite its high calling, didn't seem to be very different from any of the other nations nearby. The very last line of this book of Judges reads, "In those days there was no king in Israel, and all the people did what was right in their own eyes." And then from there it moves to the very first line of the book of Ruth, and it reads, "In the days when the judges ruled." This is the context for the story of Elimelech and Naomi, their sons and their daughters-in-law. If you haven't read the book of Ruth for a while, I encourage you to read it. I'm referring to the entire book and the entire story. Hopefully you won't get lost. I'll give you enough, but read it and see what it says. But this is the setting. Naomi, her name means pleasing, but just a few verses beyond what we read this morning, Naomi asked to be called Mara, which means bitter. She had had a rough go of it, and it took her to a place of bitterness. She had to endure a famine. She became a refugee, a widow, a grieving mother. She was too old to be a bride and too old to bear any more children, much less a son. And without being connected to a male in that culture, she was at risk for her very survival. I can see bitter. Orpah and Ruth come into the family after take Moabite wives. You know, it sounds like it could be a really beautiful story. I'm not so sure. I wish it were a story where these people fell in love across different cultures and they made it work, you know, along the lines of West Side Story, perhaps. But that verb that is translated as take in the book of Ruth is also the same verb that's translated as take in the book of Judges. There it is describing the men who took wives after they were abducted and raped. Ruth's name means friend, and that's what she became to Naomi. That beautiful relationship between mother-in-law and daughter-in-law, and it's memorialized in those famous words we often take out of context, "Where you go, I go." It's a bond that was forged between two women who whose value and purpose were defined by men. It's a bond that was forged in the most desperate of circumstances when their very survival was at risk. It's a bond that surpassed love of country. When Naomi and Ruth returned to Judah, life was still difficult, but there was hope. There was hope because in Judah there was a law that commanded that the farmers leave the corners of their fields unharvested for the poor among them to come and glean. There was hope because in Judah there's a law that provided for a widow to have a new husband in the same family. The deceased husband, a relative, would then marry that widow. It's known as the Levirate marriage, and it was a way to secure a future for women, widows. There was hope in Judah. There was hope. And Boaz was the one that personified that hope. Boaz is the relative that, according to the Levirate marriage, was the one who would marry Ruth and assure a continuation of the ancestral line. And it just so happened that Boaz was also the one who owned the field that Ruth was gleaning in. Boaz wasn't immediately respondent to the idea of fulfilling his obligation under the Levirate marriage. No, he thought it was enough to simply let them glean in the fields. It took a bit of cunning and positioning for Ruth, along with the coaching of Naomi, in order for him to realize his responsibility. I suppose Boaz could have felt manipulated. He could have made excuses. He might have gotten defensive when they positioned him to take on this responsibility he hadn't planned on taking on. And I'm sure Boaz could have found plenty of people around him that would have given him justification for, just let it be. There are others. You don't need to really do much of anything. Besides, Ruth is a Moabite, after all. That's an important detail in her story. She is named as a Moabite 8 times in that short 4 chapters of her story. Ruth, the Moabite, is the one that asked Boaz to fulfill the laws of his own country. Ruth, the Moabite, reminded Boaz of the principles out of which his nation was born. There are so many things about America that I am proud of. We pledge our allegiance to a land where there is liberty and justice for all. We declare our independence with the words that we know we have certain inalienable rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And we hold on to our union when we speak the words, we the people. And it has taken people like Frederick Douglass, Susan B. Anthony, Cesar Chavez, Harvey Milk, and so many more to help us live into these principles. And we still have a long way to go. We still have a long way to go because we know that still in our country, liberty, justice, and unalienable rights only apply to some. We still have a long way to go because we know that there are people who are left out when we say we, the people. We still have a long way to go because our union is so fractured. The book of Ruth, it could have been called Naomi. It could have been called Naomi, and that might have been better because, Naomi comes from all the right places, and she has all the right ancestry. She is from Bethlehem of Judah, and she is a descendant of Abraham, the people of God. Naomi might have been a better title. Or Boaz. Maybe Boaz would have been even better because Boaz has all of that right lineage, that right place of origin, and he's the male, which makes his voice all the louder and more respected and carries more weight. But that's not what this book is called. This book is called Ruth, the Moabite. Ruth reminded Boaz that the land of Judah was to be the land flowing with milk and honey, a land devoted to God and God alone, the land that would take care of the widows and the orphans and the strangers. It was Ruth. And Boaz listened. And he changed course. They were wed. And Ruth bore a son who became the father of Jesse, who became the father of David, and on down through the line until Joseph became the husband of Mary, who bore Jesus. Who is telling us that America is not what we think it is? And are we listening? If the book of Ruth is to have any relevance for us this day, maybe it is as an invitation for us to listen, to change course, and then to see what can be born from this great nation of ours. May it be so. Amen.